Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending Yellowstone National Park's Native Fish Conservation Program update. My name's Linda, and I'll be your host. After today's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. You can submit your questions at any point throughout the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button. And on some screens, it'll be at the top, and others, it'll be on the bottom. So you want to look for that. It's got a question mark, says Q&A. You can ask your questions at any time, and we'll answer them when the presentation is over. Let's see. And if you need live captioning during this meeting, you can do so by clicking on the captions button. So now I'd like to turn it over to the leader of the Native Fish Conservation Program, Todd Koel, to introduce today's topics and presenters.
Thank you, Linda. Welcome everyone to our spring 2025 information sharing meeting for the Native Fish Conservation Program in Yellowstone National Park. For the past few decades, we've been holding these public meetings each spring to update everyone on progress we've made on our fisheries projects over the past year, and then what our plans are for the coming year. Today, the presentation will be given by 3 biologists within our program. Drew Macdonald, who will focus on cutthroat trout recovery in Yellowstone Lake. Andriana Puchany, who will focus on native fish restoration in streams and small lakes. And Mike Canetta, who will provide updates on our aquatic invasive species prevention program in the park. So to start, I'll turn it over to Drew to talk about Yellowstone Lake.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Todd, for that introduction. And gotta get control of this. There we go. And like Todd said, I'm going to talk about Yellowstone Lake, the ongoing lake trout suppression program that we have going on, and what we're seeing right now for the restoration of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So Yellowstone Lake is home to one of the largest genetically unaltered populations of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the world. And anglers from all over the world come here to try and get a chance to catch these big, beautiful fish. And we're hearing a lot of great things right now with all the suppression effort we're doing. But Yellowstone cutthroat trout are also a keystone species in Yellowstone Lake. So these fish are food items for a lot of different species in the park, including grizzly bears, black bears, different species of birds, otters. So they play a vital role in the food web and the ecosystem in Yellowstone National Park. But the problem is in 1994, park biologists learned that there was a new species that was in Yellowstone Lake. So lake trout were introduced into Yellowstone Lake in 1994. And from what biologists know from this population of fish, or the species of fish in other Western lakes, is that there are a lot of issues that occur between our native species and this particular non-native species. So the specific problems we have with lake trout is they're a long-lived piscivorous species. So these fish can live upwards of 30 years old, or reach ages of up to 30. And piscivory is when they eat other species. So they eat other species of fish, which doesn't bode well for Yellowstone cutthroat trout when they're in the same system. These fish are also highly fecund, meaning that they can produce thousands of eggs when they go to spawn, and they also spawn in deeper areas of the lake. So they're not an accessible food source. They can't one-to-one replace what Yellowstone cutthroat trout do, because they're able to be reached in the tributaries by all these other species. And here's an example of one of these lake trout that we caught right after ice off a few years ago. And you can just see that they're consuming a lot of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And you have to imagine this is only one lake trout. And if the population is really, really large, this would have a really large impact on the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population in Yellowstone Lake. So just to show kind of what's happened graphically, you can see as the lake trout population, this is biomass, as the biomass of lake trout increased over the years, we see that the Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawning fish have actually decreased by a lot. So this is kind of what we were dealing with before we got into the next part, which is talking about how the suppression program kind of took over. So in 2012, the National Park Service ramped up gill netting efforts because we had started it in 1995, but we realized that we needed to add some more nets to actually cause an effect to this population. We ended up bringing contractors in, and with those contractors, their fishing expertise and their additional boats and gears allowed us to greatly increase the number of nets we were fishing each year. So this is just a video of what's going on. So in this video, this is the contractors setting the gill nets. Gill nets have a float line and a lead line, which allows it to stand up underwater. And then they use this hydraulic lifter to bring the fish onto the boat. And then they pick the fish out, and then somebody is out there popping the swim bladder of these fish. Because we ultimately, these fish consumed things in Yellowstone Lake. And so those nutrients that have built up in the bodies of those fish, we wanted to be reintroduced into the system. So after we pop the swim bladders, we send them back down to the depths of Yellowstone Lake, where they are ultimately taken up by the system. So along with gill netting, the contractors also brought trap netting. So we use these trap nets as just an alternative method to increase some of our effort that's going out for gill netting. So we supplement some of that with trap netting, and this allows us to catch some of the larger fish in shallower areas where we would expect there to be bycatch between Yellowstone cutthroat trout and lake trout. And we've also been using some of the data we've been getting from the trap nets for some of the ongoing research we have. In this map, you can kind of see this is depicting all the net sets that were done in 2024 by the contractors and including the Park Service, because ultimately we are still gill netting on Yellowstone Lake. And the colors correspond to the different boats that were fishing those areas. So as you can see, for instance, the kokanee fished primarily in the West Thumb. All in all, in 2024, we ended up putting out somewhere around 5,000 miles of net. So there is a lot of effort that's going out into Yellowstone Lake to try and remove these lake trout. And as you can see, we've removed since 1995. So this is 30 years of gill netting effort we've been doing on this lake. We've removed almost 5 million lake trout from the system. So, tremendous amount of effort is going into trying to remove these fish. And what we've seen is that over the years, our age 2 fish of lake trout, they've unfortunately been relatively stable. We see some fluctuations in the total abundance of those fish year by year, but we're trying to figure out ways to kind of deal with these fish right now. But the good news is that the age 3 to 5 fish are in a decline right now, and we're seeing a strong decline in our age 6 and older lake trout. And this is really promising because these fish are the fish that are actually consuming more lake trout than these other age classes are here. So by removing these fish or getting to them a level where they can't impact the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population as much, we're starting to see a lot of benefits. But back to that age 2-year class, we ultimately needed to figure out some way to try and drive that population down too. So we started looking at alternative suppression methods. And one of those methods was a carcass analog pellet. And we deployed this pellet on Carrington Island in a larger scale. We did some sampling in different areas first where we did some experiments, but ultimately we found out that this could work at a larger scale. And we used these pellets in 2019, 2020, 2024, so just this last year, and we're planning to do it again in 2025. And for instance, these are the pellets, and this is what a lake trout embryo looks like. So the hope is that these pellets will fall in the cracks of all these rocks. And this is actually Carrington Island right here. So this is a spawning site after treatment. And you can kind of see all this pellet material here. But basically, these pellets will go through into the rocks, and then they'll decrease the dissolved oxygen in the system to a level where it's lethal to lake trout embryos. So we're able to induce embryo mortality, which is hopefully going to allow us to decrease some of that age 2 fish that we're seeing coming into the system. And so here's just a video of what we're doing with the pellets. And so in 2024, we had large helicopters come out with this sling loader, and they dispersed pellets around Carrington Island to get coverage on the spot. So this is what the island looked like before we put pellets down. And then after we did the pellets, this is what it looked like. So what you're seeing here is actually the pellets are on the bottom, and that reflecting of light is just showing the pellets. So this area now that looks green is just completely covered in pellets. So while the alternative suppression methods have been really promising, and we've been doing some different stuff to experiment with those alternative methods, ultimately, the suppression netting and the suppression netting effort is what's really helping us drive this population of lake trout down. And so we're always planning to be gill netting on Yellowstone Lake to continue to hold that lake trout population back. But while we're doing that, we also need to assess our goals of what we're doing with the lake trout population. And so it's really hard to assess populations if we're not doing some form of standardized monitoring. So National Park Service, our group, we go out every year in August and we sample at some fixed sites that we've established through some protocols that we started in 2010. And we go out and sample for Yellowstone cutthroat trout and lake trout at 3 different depth stratas. And we use that information to feed into our larger population model for lake trout, which allows us to then determine what we're going to do the following year for the lake trout suppression effort. So how many nets we need to put out and what mesh sizes, all of that stuff, which has been helping us drive this population down. The cool thing is, though, is like I said, we're also looking at Yellowstone cutthroat trout data. So as you can see in this figure, I'm not going to explain the whole thing because it's really complicated, but basically you can see here that the lake trout population were discovered in 1994. And you can see this line right here, which is indicating the cutthroat trout CPUEs, so we can assess that to abundance. But the abundance of Yellowstone cutthroat trout were decreasing when lake trout were found. And we kind of hit this slump over here, which is kind of what you saw in the previous figure. In 2009, we had little to no Yellowstone cutthroat trout left, or we weren't seeing them in spawning tributaries. But when intensive gill netting started in 2012, you can see that this population actually started to increase. And now in 2024, we're actually in between our primary and our secondary benchmark. So this is really promising for the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population in the lake. Not only are we seeing in the data, but we're also hearing a lot of great information from our anglers who are visiting Yellowstone National Park and fishing the lake. They have been very happy with what they've been seeing. We've had people who are coming back year after year who are saying they've seen more Yellowstone cutthroat trout when they're fishing, catches are up, and everybody's very excited about what's going on in Yellowstone Lake. But, in order to fully understand what's going on, we're still going to have to continue doing some of this research we've been doing. And so we do have ongoing research right now to try and fully understand what's going on, because we don't want to say that we're done until we make sure that what's going on with the Yellowstone cutthroat trout is actually healthy for the ecosystem. And so this research looking at, we're tagging Yellowstone cutthroat trout for abundance estimates. We're working on juvenile Yellowstone cutthroat trout and lake trout ecology. And we're also looking at nutrient cycling. So tying back into what's going on with that pellet treatment. And just to remind everybody, for the past few years, we have been tagging all these cutthroat trout. And so there are some swimming around in Yellowstone Lake, and you'll probably find them in the Yellowstone River. And they have these Floy tags attached to their dorsal fin, or right next to their dorsal fin. And so we're just asking, or want to remind everybody that we need you guys to call or text this number and then report this tag number back to us so that we can actually continue with that data collection and move forward with some of this really interesting research we're looking at to, ultimately help the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population in the lake. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy, and she's going to talk to you about some of the streams and lakes in Yellowstone National Park.
Great, thank you, Drew. Hi, everybody. My name is Andy, and today I'll be discussing our native fish conservation work in streams and rivers outside of Yellowstone Lake. And I will also touch on our Yellowstone fly fishing volunteer program and how you could get involved in other ways to help our fisheries in Yellowstone National Park. And so I'll start with a review of our conservation work on Yellowstone cutthroat trout in streams and rivers. And most of our stream conservation work on Yellowstone cutthroat trout occurs in the northeast portion of the park in the Lamar River watershed, where we have a large interconnected population that is a stronghold for this species. And this population holds very important ecological and socioeconomic values. However, this population has been threatened by non-native fish. And the most prolific of these threats is the loss of genetics through hybridization with introduced rainbow trout. And these photos really highlight the hybridization problem that's occurring in the Lamar River watershed. So on the top, we have a genetically unaltered Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and on the bottom, a rainbow trout with a hybrid of the two species in the middle. We are also combating brook trout in some areas of this watershed, which are also a non-native species. And we run into issues with brook trout and Yellowstone cutthroat trout because where they coexist, brook trout tend to outcompete and push out Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And something that is always at the forefront of our mind is the potential future invasion of a new species. For instance, the smallmouth bass, which has been slowly encroaching closer to the Yellowstone River from downstream. Smallmouth present a threat because they are highly predatory and athletic and could cause serious harm to our native trout populations in rivers. So we have several tools that we use to combat non-native species and conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So first, we conduct annual electrofishing surveys, and this is both to monitor the population, but also to selectively remove non-native and hybrid fish when we encounter them. And additionally, anglers have been an incredible tool that we have used to target and remove non-native fish and hybrids through must-kill angling regulations. And this helps our conservation efforts at a much larger scale than is feasible with just our fish program. We also use isolation techniques to proactively stop non-native fish invasions from downstream. So for example, a concrete barrier was built in Slough Creek, which is a tributary to the Lamar River, and that was built in 2018 to curb rainbow trout from invading from downstream. And unfortunately, this barrier was damaged in the 2022 flood event, but it was fixed in 2024 and is now functioning again to prevent non-native fish invasions from downstream. And in some areas, such as in Soda Butte Creek and Elk Creek, we have used the application of the fish pesticide rotenone to completely remove non-native and hybrid populations, which allows us to start with a clean slate and restock these systems with only native species. And so with all of these combined management efforts, we're actively protecting and managing nearly 80% of the Yellowstone cutthroat trout's historical distribution downstream of Yellowstone Lake. So now I'll transition to our work with West Slope cutthroat trout and Arctic grayling conservation in streams. West Slope cutthroat trout and Arctic grayling are native to the Gallatin and Madison River drainages in the northwest portion of Yellowstone, but declines occurred in these species mostly due to hybridization and competition with non-natives. Genetically unaltered West Slope cutthroat trout were reduced to just 2 stream kilometers, and Arctic grayling were completely extirpated from park waters. So in the late 2000s, the Native Fish Program established a goal to restore West Slope cutthroat trout and Arctic grayling to 20% of their historical range within the park boundary. To restore these species, we use barriers to isolate headwater populations. We apply pesticide to remove compromised populations, and then we restock with native fish. So the dark purple areas in this map show where we've completed headwater restoration projects and are also monitoring these populations for recovery. And the most recent of these projects occurred in the Upper Gibbon River watershed. And this watershed includes 3 large lakes and about 10 miles of stream that are naturally isolated by existing waterfalls. And after non-native fish removals, we stocked this system with more than 100,000 West Slope cutthroat trout and nearly 300,000 Arctic grayling since 2017. And this is a little bit of what that looks like. With the help from our Montana grayling recovery partners, these Arctic grayling were raised from the egg stage to the fry stage in the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks hatchery in Big Timber, Montana. And then the fish were loaded into coolers. We drove them to Yellowstone and hiked them 3 miles into the backcountry to release them into their new home, where they looked very happy to be released. So after stocking these systems, we conduct annual monitoring to ensure that the populations are recovering as they should be. And so these figures here are called length frequency histograms, with length in millimeters on the x-axis and the number of fish caught in that category on the y-axis. And West Slope are shown in gray and Arctic grayling are shown in blue. And with the help of our Yellowstone fly fishing volunteer program, we documented the presence of both large and small fish throughout this watershed. And we have also documented natural reproduction of both species in this system, which we're really happy to see. And this monitoring helps inform future management actions. For example, Arctic grayling comprised 9% of the population in 2024, which is used to inform our stocking decisions for the upcoming year. And this is also part of a larger ongoing population abundance study. So this video is a West Slope cutthroat trout that was caught, measured, Floy tagged, and released back into the system. And going into the future, it will be used to help estimate abundance and inform survival. And so if you're out fishing in the Upper Gibbon watershed, please, and catch a tagged fish, please report that back to us at the number that is listed on the tag. And also be sure to report the individual tag number associated with that fish. And so these types of restoration projects help make our fish populations resilient, but they also provide for a more resilient ecosystem. And we frequently observe species that rely on fish as a food source in these project areas, such as this picture of a nesting pair of common loons that were in Grebe Lake in 2024. And to date, we've restored West Slope cutthroat trout to 18% of their historical distribution within the park boundary, with plans to continue restoration work to meet our goals for both West Slope and Arctic grayling. So now for an update on our 2024 Yellowstone Fly Fishing Volunteer Program, which is an instrumental part of many of our studies and conservation work in the park. So in 2024, 65 volunteers participated over 8 weeks of work. And during that time, they landed over 950 fish, which was used to inform population abundance, monitoring, hybrid monitoring, species composition, and presence absence data. If you or anyone you know would be interested in helping collect data for our fish program, I encourage you to please reach out to our Yellowstone Fly Fishing Volunteer Program Coordinator, Mr. Paul Weimer. Although volunteer selections have been made for 2025, opportunities to participate for 2026 will be open sometime next spring. And you can reach out to Paul at this email for more information, volunteerflyfishing@yellowstone.org. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to my portion of the talk, and I will be handing the rest of this over to Mike Canetta to discuss our aquatic invasive species and regulations information.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Mike Canetta, and I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Biologist and Coordinator for Yellowstone National Park. We have 3 goals for our program here in Yellowstone that kind of guide our AIS work here in Yellowstone National Park. First and foremost is the prevention of the introduction of new AIS into Yellowstone. Obviously, we are tasked with protecting native species, so our job first and foremost is to make sure we're doing that by preventing new AIS from entering Yellowstone waters. We also monitor for the presence of known AIS in park waters, as well as conduct early detection monitoring to try and catch new invaders as soon as they show up so that we can make informed decisions about how to manage them and hopefully prevent their spread. And of course, education is a huge part of what we do. So we work with boaters, anglers, and the broader public to make sure that the message about AIS and clean, drain, dry for all equipment is widespread and that we're working together to acknowledge our role in preventing the spread of AIS. So it's mid-May, and it's an exciting time of year here in Yellowstone because we are closing in on the beginning of our boating and fishing season here in the park. So I do want to talk briefly about the season and what to expect and important reminders for boaters and anglers as you prepare for the season. So the general boating and fishing season begins on the Saturday Memorial Day weekend, which is May 24th this year, and it runs through October 31st, when large portions of the park will begin to close for the winter. Just a brief reminder that as of 2024, portions of the Madison River and Gardner River are now open to year-round fishing. So that is 2 small segments of water where you can fish around the year in Yellowstone National Park. But for the most part, most waters do not open until the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. As far as boating goes, the season aligns with that general season. Non-motorized watercraft are permitted on most lakes and ponds within the park. However, motorized watercraft are only permitted on Lewis Lake and the vast majority of Yellowstone Lake. A key component of ensuring we're protecting our waterways here in Yellowstone National Park and preventing the introduction of AIS is watercraft inspections. So the overarching message I have is that all boats have to be inspected by our Yellowstone staff before they launch in Yellowstone waters, motorized or non-motorized. And I'll just add that non-motorized includes boats such as canoes, kayaks, angler float tubes, small inflatable rafts. Pretty much anything you're going to use to boat in waters in the park must be inspected at a Yellowstone inspection location before it is used in Yellowstone waterways. And what we're doing in that inspection process is ensuring that these vessels are clean, drained, and dry, and aren't bringing any foreign matter or potentially live invasive organisms into our waterways. Last year in 2024, we saw just over 3,700 total boat inspections at our park stations, which was fairly consistent with the 10-year average. So not really any dramatic variation from that over the past decade, which suggests that boating continues to be a fairly popular recreational activity here in the park. As far as what you can and can't bring in the water, it is important to note that there are some equipment and types of boats that are prohibited from use here in Yellowstone. So regardless of if we can inspect them or not, they cannot be used because they pose an unacceptable level of risk of introduction of AIS. And that includes any watercraft with a ballast tank or a similar sealed area that cannot be visually inspected. A boat that has been previously mussel fouled. So these are boats that have been in waters and with quaggar zebra mussels and have had mussels colonize them. So regardless of cleaning or dry time, these boats are not allowed in Yellowstone Park waters. And last but not least, this applies to boaters, anglers, and potentially others, but felt-soled wading boots have been prohibited in Yellowstone for a number of years now and continue to be because they are a known vector for several species of AIS, including whirling disease and New Zealand mud snail. So just some important reminders as you begin to prepare for the upcoming boating and fishing season. You do need a Yellowstone boat permit and a Yellowstone fish permit if you intend to engage in those activities within Yellowstone National Park. And I'll just note that those are different than, say, the permits you would get to fish in the state of Montana or the state of Wyoming. We have our own unique permitting system. Fishing permits are available at a number of locations within the park, as well as on recreation.gov. Boating permits are available at most backcountry offices in Yellowstone National Park. And for a full list of where you can acquire those, you can find that on our boating page on the Yellowstone website. As far as getting your inspection before you go boating, our 3 inspection locations at Bridge Bay Ranger Station, Grant Ranger Station, and Lewis Lake Ranger Station will open for the season with the beginning of the boating season on May 24th. Grant Ranger Station and Lewis Lake Ranger Station will remain open through the end of the boating season on October 31st. Inspections will be available daily at those 3 sites from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And that includes entrance inspections, exit inspections, and boat seals as well for departing boaters. I'd like to remind everyone that a 30-day dry time is still required for sailboats and some motorized watercraft before they can launch in Yellowstone waters. And those motorized watercraft include watercraft with inboard engines, inboard outboard, or also known as stern drive engines, as well as inboard jet propulsion systems. So those boats must observe a 30-day dry time. To fulfill that, they need to be inspected and sealed by an approved agency or partner of Yellowstone National Park. And for a full list of those states and agencies where you can have your boat inspected and sealed prior to coming to Yellowstone, you can find that on our website as well. I'll add that We do conduct exit inspections and seals at all 3 of our watercraft inspection locations. So for watercraft that have observed a 30-day dry time, we can seal your boat before you leave the park as you depart the water. And if you return with that seal still intact, you do not need to wait another 30 days before you can return to Yellowstone, so long as the seal is still intact. Just pivoting a little bit from the boating and watercraft and AIS prevention side to, what are we doing to keep our finger on the pulse of AIS and what are we doing for monitoring? The answer is quite a bit in recent years. So I'll just preface this by acknowledging that we do have several species of AIS in the park. Some of them have been here for a long time, such as lake trout, which have been previously discussed. We also have fairly widespread populations of New Zealand mud snails in many drainages in the park, especially those thermally influenced ones on the west side of the park. We have a noted population of red rim Melania in the Gardner River, which is a small aquarium snail. And we do know of populations of whirling disease in the park, which can pose threats to fish. The impacts of these AIS we have currently vary wildly from area to area, year to year. New Zealand mud snails is an example. We don't see significant impacts. They often boom early, stabilize, and kind of everything sorts itself out. But there are AIS we don't have that we are very worried about what would happen if they got introduced into Yellowstone, particularly quagga and zebra mussels. These organisms are native to the Black and Caspian Seas. They have entered the United States through primarily ballastings on large shipping containers, and they have crept further and further west and closer to Yellowstone National Park in recent years. Most of our monitoring is focused on these organisms because they can have such substantial impacts to waters when they get here. They alter infrastructure, they can really mess with recreational opportunities, and they can completely upend ecosystems. So in recent years, we have implemented several monitoring programs to make sure that we are looking for them in our waterways throughout the park. And if they show up, we can do something about it. In 2024, we conducted extensive eDNA sampling park-wide, as well as plankton sampling in Yellowstone and Lewis Lake, where the vast majority of boating occurs, to look for quagga and zebra mussels. And through this sampling, we again found that we do not have populations of these things, thankfully. So we're trying to stay on the cutting edge of this stuff. We're going to continue to monitor and hopefully increase our capacity in 2025 because vigilance is key. And if something like this were to show up in Yellowstone waterways, the sooner we catch it, the better, not just for Yellowstone National Park, but also for neighboring entities downstream in Montana, Wyoming, and beyond. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel for questions.
All right, thank you. That was great. Thanks. And so now we have time for questions. If you have not already submitted your questions, go ahead and look for the Q&A button either in the top or the bottom of your screen, and then go ahead and type in your questions, and we'll go ahead and answer them. I'll give it another couple of minutes. I guess our presenters did a really good job in answering your questions and providing great information. Thank you.
Hey, Drew,
Yeah.
what happens to the lake trout after you net them from the lake? What goes on with the lake trout that get killed out there?
Well, all of those fish, we collect length data, where we caught them, figure out what mesh sizes were most effective in those areas where we were actually netting. And then those fish, we pop their swim bladders, we take them out to deeper areas in Yellowstone Lake, and we send them back down to the bottom. And that's just solely to keep the nutrients that have been built up in their body in the system so that it can be taken up by the system and used by hopefully other organisms in there, like the phytoplankton and zooplankton and everything else that feeds on itself and, you know, gets taken back by the food web.
Nice. Does anyone else have any questions out there? I see we have folks that are out attending. Anything you'd like to ask us? I'll ask a basic one to Andy. Those little grayling that you stocked into the Grebe and Wolf Lakes, how long does it take them to grow up to be a size that people can catch with a fishing rod?
It takes about a year. And granted, they're a little bit small at 1 year old, probably around 6 inches, but grayling are actually one of the faster growing salmonids. And so by year 3, they can be up to 14 inches long that we've seen in these really productive watersheds.
Nice. They're one of my favorites for sure.
Mine too.
Okay, then I'll pick on Mike with my last question. Hey, Mike, so what, the quagga zebra mussels are probably the most worrisome invasive species sort of coming towards Yellowstone over time. What are the closest known populations of these really invasive animals to Yellowstone right now that we know of?
Yeah, so quagga and zebra mussels tend to be the focus of most AIS prevention programs, whether those be federal, state, or nonprofits, just because they can have such extensive impacts to waterways once they get introduced. That's not to say that we're not vigilant for other things, like curly leaf pondweed or Eurasian water milfoil. And now we have a new invader called the golden mussel, which was found in California in 2024, that we now need to be thinking about what are the vectors and pathways with which this might start to spread throughout the West. But as far as quagga and zebra mussels go, unfortunately, we are seeing populations get closer to the park. And they usually kind of jump and make big jumps because the primary pathway for their movement is trailered watercraft, which, you know, you can tow a boat 10, 12 hours and cover whole states in a day, basically. Recent populations that have kind of put us on red alert include a population of zebra mussels that established in Lake Pactola, South Dakota, on the Wyoming-South Dakota border. A 2023 discovery of quagga mussels in the Mid-Snake River in Idaho, just a few hours from Yellowstone National Park, as well as in 2024, a detection of zebra mussels further up into kind of the upper Colorado River system in Colorado. So they're kind of in all over the states around us except Montana and Wyoming at this point, but they're getting closer. So, you know, can't let our guard down.
Yeah. I see there's a question for Andy in the chat.
Yeah, so
Oh, sorry, Linda, go ahead.
that's fine. Go ahead.
The question is, does electrofishing affect other species, Andy, in the streams where you do that?
Yeah, so we can catch other species through electrofishing, such as small dace and minnows. But generally, they're less affected in that they don't come to the surface because they're smaller. They sit on the bottom, which is especially the case for sculpins, which we have a lot of in the western portion of Yellowstone National Park. But they are flashed. Sometimes we net them. Sometimes they go by so quickly that we don't. And then, but they do recover. Generally, we run our electrofishing equipment at low voltage levels as to make sure we're not harming the cutthroat or any other species.
Yeah, good. Any other questions out there from anybody? This is your chance. Okay.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters and everyone online. We'll provide a recording of this presentation. It'll be in the chat below. It'll be on YouTube, so you can watch this at a later time and share it with friends and family as well. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great day.